Добрый день. Мы с вами поговорим сегодня о комплексе мер по минимизации последствий санкций для российской экономики, для граждан нашей страны. Мы с вами в контакте по этим вопросам практически ежедневно. Вот сейчас только с председателем правительства некоторые вопросы обсуждаем.
Iran, up until 2012, was a fast-growing economy. It was keeping up with other similar countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia in the region in terms of its growth rates. After 2012, it starts to diverge, and Iran's economy first shrinks and then stagnates, whereas the other countries in the region continue to grow. In the case of Russia, I think it will be interesting to see whether that same phenomenon happens. Even if an economy is resilient, for millions of households and for many businesses, this will be a period of incredible hardship. And one of the things that we have seen in Iran is that a lot of families that used to live very comfortably and have a good standard of living, because of the economic situation, fell into poverty. It was no longer possible to afford foreign travel, to afford engaging in certain kinds of, for example, education abroad. It was no longer possible to enjoy the same range of luxuries domestically in Iran, because the cost of all goods and services are getting more expensive. The cost of food is getting more expensive. Literally the things you're able to buy at the store change. Families that used to enjoy red meat once or twice a week as part of a family meal, maybe now can enjoy that once a month. Or have to move from red meat to increased consumption of chicken, for example.
The economic consequences for his economy are going to be devastating. Devastating.
When sanctions are used to target an economy, is that there's an effort to reduce the revenues available to the targeted government. So in the case of Iran, around 80% of government budgets in times of high oil prices are directly related to oil sales. And so if the sanctions are successful in significantly reducing the oil exports, it creates a lot of fiscal pressure on the government. The government has conceivably less money to spend. But the reality is that for governments like Iran and like Russia that ultimately are fairly wealthy and have significant resources because of the revenues that they've had historically, the reserves they've built up, are reasonably successful at finding ways to maintain the kinds of spending that keeps their power. So they prioritize spending on basically the salaries for civil servants. They prioritize spending on the parts of the government that are important for the control of the state, like the police force, and of course, from a national security perspective, they continue to spend on the military.
Мы создаем новый федеральный орган исполнительной власти на базе внутренних войск МВД, создаем национальную гвардию.
Просто денег нет. Значит, найдем деньги, сделаем индексацию. Вы держите здесь, вам...
Where they stop spending as much is on programs that are intended to help ordinary people, especially as they face economic hardship. And we've seen this a little bit in Russia since the Crimea sanctions in 2014, when the Russian economy's performance has weakened. One of the logics of sanctions policy is that you create economic hardship for ordinary people. They complain to their government, maybe they engage in protests, and that bottom-up pressure is what leads to a change in the behavior of the state. But what we know from the recent examples, for example, Iran, Venezuela is also an interesting case of this. When you make ordinary people significantly poorer, but the government in relation remains relatively in the same position with regards to its economic power, it's actually harder for ordinary people to hold their government accountable. And I think those dynamics are pretty concerning.
Мы в ходе работы в спокойном режиме будем решать все.
There's a possibility that through diplomatic means, there will be an end to the violence in Ukraine. and there will be some kind of stalemate or some new status quo, similar to the way there was with Crimea in 2014. But what will not necessarily happen in that scenario is that that does not mean that the sanctions will all be removed or even mostly be removed. It's unclear what the conditions are for the sanctions to be removed. Is it that there's simply an end to the violence in Ukraine? There's a kind of stalemate or a ceasefire? Is it that Vladimir Putin would have to withdraw forces from Ukraine altogether? Or is it, as some sanctions proponents have sort of implied, that there would be a regime change in Russia and that Vladimir Putin is no longer in power, and that's the only situation where the sanctions are lifted? And so given the lack of clarity on the goals, and given the fact that if Russia looks to countries like Cuba or Iran, where sanctions have been placed for a very long time, there's a reasonable expectation on the part of the Russian leadership. It is reasonable for them to expect that they are going to be under sanctions for, certainly a few years, possibly a decade, possibly in perpetuity, so long as this is the sort of composition of the Russian government. And that changes the dynamics around escalation, because it means that there's very little incentive for Putin to change course in order to try and gain sanctions relief if he has low confidence that that sanctions relief is possible or available. This is a problem that I'm hopeful that US policymakers are thinking about, and that they will take some steps in the coming weeks, certainly as we reach some kind of end game with regards to the conflict in Ukraine, to make clear the kinds of diplomatic agreements or understandings that might lead to sanctions relief. But it's also really important that Western policymakers are clear about this for the Russian public, because there will always be this idea of how do we get back to where we were before the sanctions? This is something that in Iran is, always in the back of people's minds, how things were before. And, if you imagine something like McDonald's leaving Russia or ceasing its operations in Russia, after historically arriving in Pushkin Square and becoming a symbol of Russia's opening to the world, now that McDonald's has left, it's an interesting thought exercise. What are the conditions that would allow McDonald's to reopen in Russia? If they were to announce that, what would they write in the press release to say, we are opening again in Russia because X, Y, and Z has happened? What is the X, Y, and Z? And it's very hard to answer that question. And this is a major reason why we think of sanctions as something that you can turn on and off, but it doesn't work that way. They have deep consequences for countries and for economies. And certainly when they've been applied to an economy as large as Russia, they have deep consequences for how the world system is set up politically and economically. And, I think it's a reasonable expectation that we're going to be dealing with this problem for years, if not decades to come.